So I'm Judi Barrett. It's nice to be here. I'm going to talk about probably my favorite topic. It's not everybody's favorite topic, but it happens to be mine. And I want to kind of break this up a little bit to look at sort of what's happening kind of statewide, to put conditions in Barnstable County in context and then scope down to Barnstable. And you can interrupt me anytime you want. If you ask me a question about something that's going to be addressed a little later in the slides, I might just say, can you hold that comment? But anyway, this is sort of the structure of the presentation. You're advancing it, aren't you?
I'm watching.
You are awesome. You can see what I'm doing, can't you? You're great. Okay. I don't think it's a surprise to anybody that there is a housing crisis in the Commonwealth of Massachusetts. The shortage of housing nationwide is costing us about $2 trillion a year in lower wages and productivity. The lack of affordable housing has affected really all aspects of the market, and in many communities and many regions, all market levels as well. So the goal here is to create about 200,000 homes statewide, including 40,000 affordable homes and 20,000 deeply affordable homes by 2030. It's a huge climb. The fact is that we're not alone in Massachusetts. This is a national conversation. And I wanted to bring some of these images up because a few weeks back, I was at a meeting on the South Shore when the Lieutenant Governor and the recently appointed Director of the Executive Office of Housing and Livable Communities was present, and Ed, the HLC Director, was talking about things in California. And for a variety of reasons, people kind of look to California for what's happening and what California is doing to try to unlock the housing knot, because the housing situation in California is so bad. What intrigued me, however, about Ed's presentation is that he was specifically citing what California has done to enable the development of accessory dwelling units, which I think you probably all know what those are. They're units that truly are accessory by design to a typically single-family home. They may be inside the house, they may be in a separate structure, but they're accessory to a principal residential use. Unfortunately, I had to point out to Ed that at this point, we are the only state in New England that does not allow accessory dwelling units as of right. So we look nationally for models, but actually I just want to tell you, in our own backyard in New England, there's a lot of examples of what's going on. And as a planner who's been in this field for 35 years, I do find it a little bit frustrating that our sister and brother states around us are doing so much. And we have traditionally been thought of as kind of a leader in the housing world. I'm not sure we've kept up. We're trying to. But this is a national problem, and it happens to be exacerbated in states like California, like Massachusetts, like New York. There's a national focus on this as a result. I can tell you that about a year ago, a young planner that we had hired in my own firm left to take a job in the Southwest. And she told me that although she was taking a cut in pay, by the time they relocated, they would save $12,000 a year because of housing. So it is directly affecting our economy here, and I've seen it in my own firm. Because of this national concern, there's a whole lot of groups involved in the conversation about housing. They don't always say exactly the same thing, but there are some certain common threads. So as a planner, I look to the American Planning Association for guidance, and there's been quite a bit of attention from APA to the barriers to multifamily development, which is what a lot of us look at in the housing world because it's the most efficient way to get housing built, especially for people who are lower income. The Urban Land Institute is involved in this. The Urban Lands Institute sponsors an annual housing conference that's very well known. This year it's in Austin, Texas. Austin because they've probably done more to unlock housing development than probably any other city in the nation. The National Low Income Housing Coalition, I mean, this is just a very short list of groups. The National Association of Realtors, the Home Builders Association, Urban Institute, everybody's talking about housing now. And one of the things we all know is that even though it's a national conversation, it is still very much the third rail of planning. Scoping it down to Massachusetts, we have the Affordable Homes Act. Is it a paradigm shift? Some people say that it is. It promotes a pretty massive investment in housing at a variety of levels, ranging from dealing with the condition of our public housing, which is not good in the state-funded inventory, to promoting home ownership, to getting more rental housing built. There are policy changes that, with or without dollar amounts associated with them. There are a couple of executive orders involved and tax credits targeted in a number of different ways, and I can talk about that more if we need to. But, you know, as I'm sure you all know, a few months ago, Governor Healy announced this massive housing bill, and it's been discussed in a variety of places, including here on the Cape, for what it may or may not do. So one of the goals is to create 40,000 new homes for lower income, with 22,000 for lower income households and 12,000 for middle income. It's to preserve and also make resilience improvements to existing housing stock. And it's interesting to me that, again, because there's a national conversation behind all of this, we happen to be working on the 5-year HUD consolidated plan for one of the cities in Massachusetts, and sure enough, HUD is now requiring communities to look at how are you dealing with resiliency and housing policy. So everybody's kind of focusing on this. $1.6 billion to repair and modernize public housing in Massachusetts, including decarbonization. We recently worked on a housing plan for the town of Brookline, and the condition, that's probably one of the most well-known housing authorities in Massachusetts. They're very progressive. They have a pretty significant inventory of federally assisted housing, and they have been so diligent about going after every possible resource they can to update that federal housing. There hasn't been a commensurate investment by the state in public housing. So the stories we heard working on that plan about people who lived in federally assisted housing versus state-assisted housing, it was night and day. Very different experiences. People reporting to us holes in the ceiling that weren't, being fixed. And, it's not because the Brookline Housing Authority is incompetent, it's because the state has not invested in maintaining public housing. And then also funding to support alternative forms of rental housing for people who are homeless, for housing for seniors and veterans, and also transitional units for people who are in recovery from substance abuse. These are often housing types that are very hard to sell at the local level, and yet they're critically needed. So other aspects of this law, some of which may be very familiar to you, are the proposed local option tax to essentially extract from the sale of properties over a certain value a tax that can then be dedicated to support for affordable housing. The Affordable Homes Act also intends to make inclusionary zoning a little easier to adopt, in addition to multifamily housing amendments that were enacted a couple of years ago. So what this means is, when you go to town council, I have to remember where I am, when you go to your legislative body, I'll be safe here, to seek a zoning change, typically it's a 2/3 vote. But as amendments passed a few years ago by the legislature to Section 5 of Chapter 48, which is the Zoning Act, now if the amendments have to do with liberating housing development in some way, enabling multifamily housing, enabling mixed use, allowing for accessory dwelling units, then it shrinks to a simple majority vote, which from a housing perspective is critical, because this is the third rail of planning. So inclusionary zoning would now fall under that. It's going to be easier to do. The other thing that is in this bill, which I find fascinating, is again the switch to allowing accessory dwelling units as of right. As of right means you can do it. You can go get a building permit. It's basically what it means. We're the only state in New England that does not have that right now. The only state. And interestingly, Maine, which many people probably think of as, I don't know, behind the times, is actually not at all. The Maine legislature early last year, passed some pretty sweeping housing legislation that essentially says any single family district in any community in Maine can have at least two dwelling units. So there's been big conversations happening outside Massachusetts, just trying to scope this down for you so you know you're not alone and the Commonwealth of Massachusetts is not alone. There's also a homeownership tax credit to produce affordable homes for first-time home buyers at or below 120% of area median income. I suspect most of you are familiar with these terms, but essentially area median income is the median household income for your region. And the income limits that typically apply to affordable housing are percentages of that. 120% of median income, for lack of a better definition, is often associated with this concept of workforce housing. It's sort of the upper limit of it. So part of the Affordable Homes Act is thinking about incentives to create more of that housing. Now, I got to go back in my career, 30 years. When I left the town of Plymouth, where I had been the community development director, I went to work for what was then called the Executive Office of Housing and Community Development, EOCD. I had a senior moment there for a minute. Then it became the Department of Housing and Community Development, and now it's the Executive Office of Housing and Livable Communities. When I worked there, I ran the state's community development block grant allocation. And I went to boarding school out in Western Mass, so I just have this love for all of Massachusetts. Well, we had communities out there, that were receiving CDBG grants. And the staff didn't want to go out there because it was too far. And I thought, oh my goodness, I have heard in my career communities say, people in Boston think that Massachusetts begins and ends in Boston. There's some truth to that. So I just say that as a backdrop because the MBTA communities law, which you are not subject to, but all those communities are, if you just look at the geography of how the state has defined where it matters to get multifamily housing built, you kind of picture what's not there. So there's been discussion about trying to extend that, the premise of that law, which is that you will allow multifamily housing as of right, up to 15 units an acre in some locations, however you define them. There's been some discussion about extending that statewide. It's sort of like nowhere right now, except it's been in discussion. But I just put this map up there because it reminded me so much of the earlier moments in my career when I was in that place in Boston, in a state agency, and I heard people saying, you know, doesn't it end in Worcester? And it most certainly does not. So recently the Boston Globe, in an effort, did you want to ask a question?
Yeah, more of a comment slash question. Sorry, more of a comment slash question. So everything, I love everything you're mentioning. I've been coming to town council meetings lately and planning committee meetings. I love everything that Massachusetts is doing, but I feel like NIMBYism is our biggest threat to housing.
Oh, we'll get there.
Okay, we're going to get into that, okay.
You're going to get there. You're absolutely right. It's an ongoing problem, and which is why there's discussion about allowing certain types of housing as of right, because it really is probably the only way that you can get around that and provide the housing that people need. The Boston Globe, early last fall, started running a series on housing in Massachusetts, largely because of the MBTA communities law. And very much the focus, again, was on the Boston metro area, in particular looking at a couple of suburbs, Milton and Brookline. And again, this sort of focus on the Boston metro area kind of driving the conversation about housing in Massachusetts. And yet you all know, sitting at this table, and other people in Barnstable County know, there's a housing problem in Barnstable County. I'm here to tell you there's a housing problem out in Berkshire County, but it has different dimensions, a different character. But if the focus of the legislature is on the greater Boston metro area, then certain groups get left out. Enter the seasonal community designation, which, you know, has some opportunity if it actually survives in the legislature. The concept here is to develop a framework for designating a community as a seasonal community, whatever that means. Basically, it's do you have wide variations in housing occupancy over the course of a year? Enter Barnstable County, It certainly applies in other parts of the state as well, although it's very pronounced in the Cape and the Islands, probably more than any other region. But if you're in Cape Ann or if you're in South Berkshire County, you'd say, excuse me, that's us too. The intent is to sort of program housing funds in a way that is targeted to the needs of a particular region. There's an intent to have a coordinating council. There would be a representative from the Cape and Islands so that there's a voice on the council to say, but these are actually our needs. It could mean housing assistance and other programs kind of tailored to the needs of your region. It could mean modified policies under Chapter 40B, which you probably are all aware is the Commonwealth's Comprehensive Permit Law that was enacted in 1969. It could mean the ability to require year-round housing restrictions and local option tax to develop year-round housing. Could mean those things. The concept is there. The details have yet to be worked out. And I just want to point out that, again, when you take it outside the Boston metro area, you're talking about very different regions. I don't know how many of you have ever been to South Berkshire County, but it's another world. And this is another world to people who are coming from somewhere else. So these regions have needs that really have not been met well. I remember, again, going back 30 years in my career, when I was running the state CDBG program, that there was a real tendency to sort of target the funds toward the eastern Massachusetts communities. And it was only because a lot of the towns out in Western Mass had attracted some great grant writers that those towns actually got funding. Because the whole scoring system for deciding who gets funded and who doesn't was very much focused around, again, the Boston metro, kind of out to Worcester area. So I want to just scope in a little bit on the Cape. There is a housing crisis here. There is no surprise. A lot of what I'm going to talk about comes out of the draft regional housing strategy, which many of you have probably seen, but I want to bring some of that into this anyway because I frankly think they did a great job. But there's a crisis here, and a lot of organizations are particularly aware of it and focusing on it in their own different ways. You have, can you jump it? Oh, sorry. That's okay. You have your own advocacy arms here. I'm sure I'm missing somebody on this list, so if you are affiliated with an organization that's not here, please don't yell at me. It's only so much text you can cram on a slide. But you have a lot of organizations here, many of which we have worked with. They're all focusing on housing. They're not necessarily focusing on the same need. They're not necessarily focusing on the same strategy, but they all are all in one way focusing on the dimensions of the housing crisis in the context of Cape Cod. And there was an interesting quote on the Chamber's website that I pulled because I just think it's so relevant. 47% of jobs on Cape Cod are performed by individuals who don't live here. And I think if you pull up data from the American Community Survey, you're going to find that that's a fairly consistent and actually growing trend, and it's a problem. And part of it is because so much of your housing stock is traditional single-family homes, unvaried lot sizes to be sure, but that's kind of your housing stock here, and it doesn't meet everybody's needs. And it certainly, in terms of the pricing of it, is out of reach for many people who work on the Cape. So enter the regional housing strategy. It has a needs assessment, which is really quite well done. The focus of it is on attainable housing, and in the housing world, people struggle with how do we describe what we're talking about. What's workforce housing? What's very low income housing? What's moderate income housing? And attainability, the way I think about it, is really sort of a measure of how the housing market is functioning. What is the affordability of this market in the broadest terms? So attainability is really that connection between what are the incomes of people who live in this region, what are the wage levels, and what is the housing cost? And when you equalize those things in a way that you don't end up with 47% of your workers coming from somewhere else, you begin to have a market that's more affordable and supportive of the local economy and the regional economy. I know they're working on some additional model bylaws for communities to use. You have a great planning department here. I don't know that you need model bylaws, but we work all over the Cape. And there are communities that really need that resource. They need not only the model bylaws, but they need the education. So There's that aspect of the regional housing strategy, and then thinking about ways to build local support, which gets to this whole issue of NIMBY. Not in my backyard. There is a disconnect in the housing market on the Cape. I don't think there's any question about this. It shouldn't be any surprise to anybody. What it costs to buy a house here is not commensurate with what people's incomes are. The seasonal market clearly has had an impact on how housing is priced out there in the open market. And housing prices have simply accelerated way beyond income levels. And again, it's partially because of the influence of the seasonal market and the incomes of seasonal buyers being able to compete at a higher level than people who want to live year-round on the Cape and actually have jobs here. So there are a series of key ideas in that regional housing strategy. First is, of course, just increasing the variety of housing so that we don't have such a homogeneous housing stock on the Cape. Focusing on support for the year-round population, the people who live and work here, who may have spent their whole lives here or retired, but people who are part of the year-round community. And I think we can all appreciate that for something to be a year-round community, you have to have people who live there. One of the early years I worked for Nantucket, I've done a lot of work for that island, and the first project I worked on there, I had to go there in January, and it was freezing cold, and I was starving. So I went on the little Open Table app and thought, I'll just find a place to go eat, and said, I can go to this restaurant, so I said, I'm coming, and I walked down the street in the freezing cold, and the restaurant was closed because they shut down. So the struggle to maintain a kind of year-round presence in many of these communities is really difficult. Not losing sight of the importance of redevelopment. The preservation of existing housing stock matters to the extent that investment can be preserved and enhanced is really just as important as new development. The need to coordinate housing and infrastructure, which is something I'm going to come back to in a little bit, where we try to direct housing investment ought to also be where we have the infrastructure and facilities to support it. So that regional framework, I think, is very helpful. And certainly in this community, you can see the importance of thinking about that connection between where do you promote housing development, where do you have the infrastructure. At the same time, you don't want to end up with people having limited choices about where they can live in the community. So being creative about the different types of housing you allow in different neighborhoods or different villages is going to be an important conversation here. Regionalizing efforts to support municipalities and building support for housing through education. Those are sort of the critical points of the regional housing strategy. And on this effort, effort to support municipalities through regional effort, we are working with Barnstable County right now to set up a regional housing services office, modeled after a couple that are elsewhere on the Cape. And I don't know how it's going to go, and I don't know how communities are going to feel about it, but it's an important initiative. You may have capacity here to develop and monitor your affordable housing, but not every community does. So when affordable housing gets lost elsewhere, the pressure simply mounts on those communities that do have the capacity to do this the right way. So those are sort of the elements of the housing strategy. There are other Cape-wide issues, I think, just to keep in mind. One is just limited federal resources. So we work with Elizabeth's office on the town's CDBG program. Yarmouth receives CDBG funds. I think some of the communities in the lower and outer Cape also receive CDBG funds from the state. There's two levels of CDBG. One is communities that get it directly from HUD. One is communities that get it from the state. But there's not a lot of money here, and yet there's a tremendous need. And the cost just to even run a program to do housing preservation is really dwarfed by simply the construction costs and the labor market here and the access to contractors who will work on housing that's not luxury housing. There is limited staff capacity in a lot of these communities. When I talk about capacity, I don't mean just staff, I mean funding. I also mean the strength of the volunteer base. Communities that have a lot of active volunteers, Brewster comes to mind, are in a different place than communities that really don't have that. The other challenge, of course, the obvious one, the elephant in the room, is water and wastewater. And then finally, not unique to the Cape, but every bit as important here, is this idea about what do you do about opposition and attitudes about housing and the mythology about who lives in affordable housing and who needs it. You don't have housing, you don't have a strong workforce. If people can't live in the community where they work or near it, you eventually will lose them. So here's just a few examples of jobs that are in your community now, based on data from the Executive Office of the Bureau of Labor Statistics. And these are occupational employment wages based on year-end 2022. We don't have year-end 2023 yet. But this is an elementary school teacher. The mean wage for an elementary school teacher, mean is the middle, the average. I teach your children. Do you have room for me in your town? My salary, if I'm at the mean, the mathematical mean, is $79,920. The most I can afford is $1,999 a month. Now, I'm starting high, and I'm going to work down. That assumes I don't have student loan debt or anything else that might be weighing me down. That's just 30% of my monthly gross income. That's all that is. So that has to cover my rent and my utilities. Just think about the rental housing in your community as I put these numbers up here. So here's a plumber. Mean wage, $69,070. I help you take care of your home. Do you have room in your town for me? The most I can afford for monthly rent is $1,727. I'm a home health aide. I help you age in place in your own home. Do you have room for me in your town? My salary, if I'm at the mean for Barnstable, is $36,170. The most I can afford in rent, including utilities, is $904 a month. I help you on the road to recovery. I'm a substance abuse counselor. Is there room in your town for me? My salary at the mean for Barnstable is $68,240. The most I can afford for rent is $1,706. And then finally, I'm a restaurant chef. I cook for you when you come to my restaurant. Do you have room for me in your town? My salary at the mean is $40,610. So the most I can afford for rent is $1,015. Part of why I picked those particular jobs was to also point out this concept of a location quotient, which is the relationship between the makeup of jobs in your town and some larger comparison area. Cape and Islands, if you will. So jobs like plumbers, home health aides, restaurant chefs, the location quotient for Barnstable is really high. What that means is a disproportionate amount of your job base is made up with those jobs. And you think about it, I'm sure there's no mystery to you as to why that's the case. Whereas elementary school teachers generally are a much smaller percentage of your job base. So it's just really but kind of a window into why are employers here and what kind of jobs are in demand. So it really is a reflection of the nature of the community, what it means to be a seasonal community and a community in transition in a lot of ways. So I'm going to wrap up with just a few slides to sort of focus in on the comprehensive plan and how housing fits into all of this. It's fundamentally, for cities and towns, a land use question. It's a land use policy question. What do you allow, where do you allow it, and how easy do you make it to do it, whatever types of housing it might be? I always try to tell the communities we work with on comprehensive plans, there are certain things local government can bring to managing and overseeing and guiding its own community development. One is regulation and policy. Towns know how to set regulations. God knows people know how to go to a council and get a regulation passed. And then there's infrastructure investment. Put your dollars where you think growth should go. But ultimately, kind of all of this sort of falls apart if you don't have leadership. And leadership is the most critical thing that needs to come to the table for housing. You can invest in infrastructure, you could invest in capacity, you can invest local and federal and state funds much more strategically if you have leadership. Understanding housing choice and affordable housing needs at a wide variety of incomes. People sometimes tend to really focus on a particular set of folks. It would be nice if we had a whole conversation and we could tie it to the makeup of your economy. And when we get to the economic development element a few months from now, you're going to hear more about this. Thinking about the geographic distribution of different types of housing, that's a classic comprehensive plan question. And then where does universal design fit into the framework of site development standards? And I bring this up because your community and your region has a high percentage of people, older adults, people who are 65 or over. And what I sometimes find in working more with suburbs, I guess, is the desire to have over 55 housing. People think of it as an age restriction. Oh, I got that done, fine, I have a housing zoning for people who are over 55. And nothing is in that zoning around universal design, which is the ability of people to not only have a house that they can live in, but an environment and a neighborhood where they can be mobile. So universal design is a very important part of the conversation about housing, especially in regions like this. I will just say, I think your town's done a lot compared with many communities we work in. You know, you've adopted density and dimensional changes here. You have districts and overlay districts. I find the number of districts here dizzying, but that's a local policy call, and I'm not going to go there. You allow ADUs. You have inclusionary housing policy. You have complete streets. You've done a lot in this town. And so, if anybody ever gets critical of Barnstable that you haven't done enough, you're never going to be able to do, quote, enough. But you've done a lot, and you need to give yourselves credit for it. So that ought to be reflected in the comprehensive plan as well.
Another question for you?
Go ahead, yeah.
So I've been hearing a lot of things at town level where some of the new town council members want to change zoning and things of that sort. What can we as citizens and members of this committee, which I think anyone who cares about housing, what can people who care about housing do to help Barnstable?
You're on my last slide, but
because I don't want
councilors need to hear as much noise from people who support as from people who oppose. I'm on the Board of Appeals in my community. I'm a nut. Yes, I do this too. And I don't live too far from here, but I can just tell you, when there's a public hearing, the people who don't like something will be there. They'll be there early, they sign in, and they speak. The people who support often don't come because they don't really feel like they have anything to say. When you're on the board, it matters that there's somebody there saying, this really counts. So building that support network is critical. I can't emphasize this enough. And it takes a lot of work to do it. Citizens Housing and Planning Association, CHAPA, has done a lot to try to sort of develop community engagement and housing education at the local level. And they've done a great job, but it's a lot of work. And people have to be able to sort of withstand going to a meeting and then being criticized for things that they have said. I think some questions you're going to want to think about is how do you continue to align your housing objectives and land use policies? How should you address attainability while also recognizing and targeting investments in decent year-round housing for lower wage workers, given the composition of your economy? If the local option real estate transaction fee passes, what would your priorities be? What would you do with that money? And how should Barnstable make a wider range of year-round housing choices available throughout the town while respecting a mix of place types that exist here? Thinking about effective strategies, like I said, this was 2 slides away. Engage the most affected people in your community and engage them now. Invariably, when I go do presentations like this, you know who's not here? The people who really need housing, or if they are, they don't speak.
I'll speak now and say I need housing for August.
Yeah, I mean, and it's really hard to go to a meeting and say, I'm about to lose my home, But engaging and making it safe for people to speak is critical. That takes leadership. consider an annual housing summit. One of the things I get asked a lot when we work on comprehensive plans is, so we have to have an implementation committee, right? And they're gonna, on housing, my comment is, just let the volunteers do what they need to do for all the program that needs to happen year-round. But think about an annual summit instead, where you sort of get everybody in the room and say, what did we get done this year? What were the council's goals? Did any of them include housing? Did we address them? Did we get somewhere? Do we actually have people speaking at hearings now when we didn't a year ago? The fact that zoning has changed, are we getting the housing we want? Building this coalition is probably the most important thing that you can do. Training advocates to speak at board and committee meetings, given that there's going to be a pushback against them. Tailoring housing trust funds to align well with other sources so that your leveraging capacity is as good as it can be. Building relationships with competent developers. People get really itchy about planning boards and ZBAs and town staff having a relationship with developers. Who builds housing? It's not you. It's the development community. The more you build relationships with competent developers, the more likely it is you're going to get what you want. And then my final comment, which nobody agrees with, but I have to say this. Chapter 40B is your friend, it's not your enemy. I am thrilled to see any housing initiative that happens in Massachusetts that works. But Chapter 40B has done more to get housing built than anything else in Massachusetts, and that's just reality. So I'm done.
I had a comment.
Sure.
So you did some research, regardless of what it was, looking at average salaries for school teachers, plumbers,
Yeah.
what have you. What research did you do about the cost of rentals?
Well, this is a topic that's near and dear to me right now because I did look at it. And you can find some rentals that will support the teacher. You're not finding rentals that support the chef.
Am I correct when I say that you would you agree with, I'm not trying to lead here, but one bedrooms on average, 18 to 2,200, two bedrooms, 2,300 plus.
Probably.
Three bedrooms, you're looking at about $3,000.
Yeah, that I would agree with, yeah.
So right now, in answer to those questions for do you have housing for me, no.
Right. You don't. That's why I did the slides. And, you know, it's complicated here because of the pressure of the seasonal market. So we're just starting to work now with Community Development Partnership on a sort of feasibility study of, well, what would it take to set up a year-round housing program in some of the towns in the lower and outer Cape area. And the feasibility question is tricky because I happen to be working on this in Nantucket as well. You know what the year-round housing price is that Nantucket's targeting? $1.9 million. 240% of area median income. And they're worried that they're not going to find anything in that range or anything close that they can buy down to $1.9 million. So the feasibility question, I think, for year-round housing, if you're going to be investing housing trust funds and so forth and trying to take some housing that already exists and preserve it for year-round purposes, which is one way to do it, is you got to look at that cost versus the cost to create affordable housing unit. Because an affordable housing unit's going to have to be year-round anyway. It's just part of the deed restriction. So it's sort of like, where do you put your money? And I'm not dismissing the idea of an importance of a year-round housing program. I'm just saying it's expensive if you're trying to do it by purchasing restrictions on existing homes, which is something that I think a lot of communities in seasonal and resort markets would try to do because the ability to develop enough housing is challenging for reasons like water and wastewater. So I'm not advocating for that particular approach. I am saying that it's one that's out there, but there's a cost to it. You're going to want to think about, well, how else can you do this? The added complication with the whole year-round housing question is the uncertainty about the ability of cities and towns in Massachusetts to impose a year-round housing restriction on a development.
Do we know how much housing has been built on Cape Cod because of the 40B program versus how much has been built outside of it?
So that's a great question. The problem is the subsidized housing inventory from town to town is not accurate, which is part of why the Regional Housing Services Office is being set up, is to just try to establish what really is the inventory here. I can't answer that question now. I could look into it for you, because it is an interesting question. And I never want to suggest that you should just rely on 40B. That's not my point. I'm just saying it's not the animal that people sometimes think it is. You can use it very creatively, and it's done a lot of good. I would personally rather see housing get built where people say they want to have it. But when they don't say where they want it.
Judi, could you, because I don't want to assume that everyone on the panel knows what CDBG is.
Sure, I'm sorry.
Could
I
you
was
just-
trying really hard, but after a while, Community Development Block Grant is a federal program that was established in 1974. It's part of the whole anti-urban renewal thing that kicked in the 60s. And so it is allocated by the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development to cities and communities that are kind of regional economic centers, which is kind of the situation for Barnstable and Yarmouth. And then there's another set aside that kind of comes through states. So smaller towns like Brewster and Provincetown, they get it through the state, which was the program that I ran. It is the most flexible grant program in the United States. You can do anything, almost anything with it, except construct new homes. And again, that was sort of the backlash of urban renewal, was preserve what we have, make it better. But as long as there's principally a benefit to lower moderate income people, you can do all kinds of things with it.
I have another question.
Sure.
Relative to restricting home ownership to, or home occupancy to year-round population, do we run afoul of the fair housing
That's
laws?
part of that's a big unanswered question. And that's been sort of grappled with in Provincetown and Nantucket a bit. I think the town council happens to be the same town attorney for those communities. I think their position is that as long as the town is holding the covenant, the town has authority to do that. Where it gets more complicated is imposing it on the private market. And I think there's an unanswered question about even the ability of a municipality to use public funds or public policy, public regulation to limit occupancy. It's an unanswered question, but it's an important one.
So one quick,
Sorry,
I'm the
I'll get to you in a
retired CEO from the Cape Cod Chamber of Commerce.
Yes, I
and
know.
the housing issue is really, really becoming so acute in other parts of the Cape, more so than Barnstable. And employers were literally building and buying housing to be able to stay open. And I think there's become this kind of a relaxed attitude. Is like, well, if the hospital needs housing, they'll just go get it. But I think that is also kind of a false hope, because part of our comprehensive plan that we're working on here has kind of a focus on small business, right? So you're going to ask your small business owner to become the landlord for their employees, which is actually a relationship they don't look forward to having.
Right, because they're not really skilled to do it.
It's not, they don't, it's like the company store thing.
Yeah.
So I think that there's a lot of ideas that have been bantied around, but they're not quickly solved. So can we look at other countries? I mean, when I talked with Provincetown, I suggested to the then town manager, maybe look at Bermuda, because Bermuda put into place that you had to be Bermudian to buy a home on the island, because they were having the same problems that we were, people from away could buy a house, it would be seasonal, and they were disrupting their housing situation. So, I don't know.
I bet they don't have the Federal Fair Housing Act of
There
1968.
you go. That's my point.
It's this whole question of what is government's role and right and responsibility, I think, is going to vary. It's funny, though, you should ask about looking at other countries, because the only time I've ever been to the Caribbean, naturally, what did I do? I got off the ship, I went on the excursions, I said, what about housing? What kind of I can't help myself. And I think it was St. John. It was very interesting policy. Their public housing program, if you're eligible for a public rental unit and you stay in it for 20 years, you own it. So if you think about what that does, it's enabling someone who really has very low income to have decent housing but also to invest in neighborhood stability and ultimately the ability to build some equity. So a different model, you know, a different concept. I think probably some people in housing circles, even in Massachusetts, would say, oh, well, we need to be able to build more housing. But, you know, you can't always build more. So thinking about the ability to kind of, again, build neighborhoods, build stability, and help build equity for people. It's a different model.
So I have one other question, then Asia, did you have another comment? I'm sure.
Yeah,
Fran,
you do.
okay.
She's been so patient over here.
So I have a question. I don't necessarily expect an answer now from staff, but have we done any calculation of if this local option tax were to kick in for any transfer tax on $1 million plus sale? Have you run any figures, or can we just like somebody throw some spaghetti against the wall? Okay, thanks. Fran, do you want to go ahead?
I think from my experience, I think the median income that you said for Cape Cod is very high. I think it's much lower than that, and it always has been for my lifetime, which is why we haven't had as much assistance from the state as other parts of the country. Chapter 40B, that's, you know, my problem with that is, you know, you get X number of, quote, affordable units, and then the rest are market rate, which are quickly filled up by people who can't come off Cape, come down here to retire. The same thing, you know, happens with apartments that have X, Y, Z, you know, affordable rents, and then the rest are going to be filled up by people who come down here from other places. I mean, it's like, you can watch it, it's a traditional happening. During COVID, COVID was part of the reason that our house prices skyrocketed. People paid, you know, I live in Katuitt, you know, you blink and you miss it. And people were paying ridiculous sums of money for tiny houses because they wanted to, you know, get away from the big cities in the COVID. And now they've really, you know, they're just ludicrous prices that are
So
that are
we've heard the
attached.
very same story in New Hampshire, where we happen to be doing a lot of work.
Oh.
It's those Massachusetts people who came north in the middle of COVID. But I just want to push back on one point, because I know exactly what your frustration is with 40B, about the 75% of the units being market rate. That's not 40B's fault. That's because the federal government has abdicated its responsibility for affordable housing. You know, I'm old enough to remember, really, I'm an old woman. I'm old enough to remember when HUD and really even, you know, state agencies such as Mass Housing very much focused on getting deeply affordable rental housing built. And Chapter 40B, all it is a permitting mechanism. It has nothing to do with money. It is simply a permitting mechanism. So when you take away the money, and you're now saying, in essence, we're gonna make it possible for a private industry to build this housing, and they're gonna have to figure out how to make it economic. You can use a permitting vehicle of 40B. It's not the permit. It's the lack of federal assistance for housing at all market levels. And so it's nice that Massachusetts is looking at this Affordable Homes Act, but the federal government's commitment to housing has been pretty erratic.
I think we're at 6:30.
If I talked your
Cheryl?
ear off.
Question, if I may.
Okay, hold on one second. Well, okay, so Cheryl has a comment. I just want to check in with staff because we want to go to the review of housing goals and strategies, and that's in breakout sessions, right? Okay, so I think what I'm going to do is ask Cheryl to give her comment, and then I'm going to go quickly to public comment,
Okay,
if that's
fine.
okay.
Yep.
All right, so I have three quick comments and a question, actually. So first thing, Fran, I agree with you. I think that the income is far lower on the mean income on the Cape. Also, Wendy, I agree with you. Look at other countries. I have lived overseas for 3/4 of my life, for at least half of each year. Bermuda, yes. Switzerland also has a policy whereby you're not allowed to own a property there unless you are a citizen. You have to be a citizen or have married a citizen. The UK, where I lived for 38 years, has a special policy in London, which they found worked because of the density of the population there, and it's just impossible to find anything. And they've done it for about 150 to 200 years, where the government lets you buy the property, but it's on a 99-year lease
right.
from the country.
Yep.
And it's problematic if you're looking for a property and you find it has only 8 years left of the lease, but you can renegotiate that, and that allows and everybody knows what it is, so therefore it brings money in. So I agree to go with that. I have a quick question, which I suspect you won't know the answer to, but I'm going to ask it anyway. With regard to the second dwelling unit. I know-
Accessory, you mean the accessory dwelling unit?
Accessory dwelling, yes, sorry. The accessory dwelling unit, I know some people who are interested in doing that, and then they've decided not to because they say, well, we might be able to get some money on rentals for it, but at the same time, what are we going to be taxed for it? And you don't know what the taxes are intending to be for the accessory dwelling units, is that right? Probably?
So I'm not an assessor.
Yeah?
I have asked this question of assessors. And what I've been told is that because single-family homes are appraised based on comparable sales, that the accessory dwelling unit is not as much of a factor as you might say, because it's not assessed as an income-generating unit. So I don't think the impact of the ADU is the same on a single-family home as multiple dwelling units in an investor-owned property. I just think it's a very different approach to appraisal. But certainly, I suppose somebody's assessment could change, but isn't that in their interest?
I would say
When
that
they go to sell their
I would
home?
say that it is and it isn't. I know I was talking with and one of my neighbors, and I'll say it quickly, who was thinking about doing this. And we were looking at the taxes, and so I will use myself as an example rather than them, because that's not fair.
Sure.
I have a gazebo, which is worth, it's taxed at $11,300. I think that's standard.
Yeah.
But it was. I could, yes.
It's a site
If I put a
improvement.
bed in it.
It's a site
But
improvement.
in the summer. But the thing is, it's at $11,300 on the tax. If I bought it brand new, and this is 10 years old, if I bought it brand new, it would cost, I actually called to find out what they're selling for. It's $8,200. So the tax is more. So they're saying if I do the additional unit, and I didn't know if you had the answer to that, but it sounds like it's a viable question.
I mean, I think it probably is a viable question, but again, I guess I come from the perspective that people can make economic choices based on their best interest. And if the need for an ADU, because of a family situation or something else, is why you're doing it, then you're going to do it. And if you can't afford to do it, you won't. The ability of towns to help pay, to help communities, or to help homeowners create ADUs is another kind of strategy to get them done. And it may affect the assessment. I'm not going to try to speak for your assessor. All I'm saying is that I think people are capable of making kind of market-driven choices. And it may increase their taxes now, but when they go to sell the home, it's going to have an impact.
Thank you, Judy.
Could I just make a quick comment about ADUs as somebody who has lived in a house where we had an apartment, and after that we realized that it was such a good deal financially that when we looked for our next house, we looked for a house with an apartment. So I think that it's a good deal financially.
I would think so.
If you can balance out what it would cost to build the ADU or
Yeah.
to add the ADU, but that the tax implications would probably not be a big difference.
That's kind of been my understanding, but again, I'm not an assessor.
Great. I'm trying to keep us
Yeah.
somewhat on track here. So I'm going to call for, thank you, Judy.